We could find out as early as today how the Trump administration plans to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census.
Last month, the Supreme Court justices blocked the question, arguing the administration needs to come up with a better reason to justify it. So that's what the administration has been working on for the last couple of weeks. And in a vague update yesterday, Attorney General William Barr said it's just a matter of time before we find out what that legal path could be. Kim Wehle is a CBS News legal analyst, and she's joining us now from Washington. So, Kim, the Attorney General says he sees a way to legally add the question to the census. What's he talking about?
Well, it's difficult to know. What we're hearing is that potentially the president would consider using what's called an executive order to add the citizenship question. Now, remember, the Constitution gives the power over the census to the Congress. So the Congress could fix this by actually amending the Census Act to make clear whether the citizenship question should or should not be on it. But what Congress did was give the authority to implement the census to the Secretary of Commerce. When that happens, when agencies do Congress's work, there's a procedural law that the agency has to follow. It's that procedural law that the Supreme Court found had been violated. So it sounds like a possibility would be basically take the process out of that chain of command from Congress to the Secretary of Commerce and have the president just do a presidential thing and issue an executive order saying, I say as president it should be added. That will be challenged in court for sure.
So that's very interesting. It's a good thing that you reminded us, because the conversation about the citizenship question has been about its constitutionality or whether or not it would infringe on the ability for the census to do what it's supposed to do, which is count everyone in the country. But the Supreme Court didn't even visit any of that stuff. They were just concerned with who's responsible for okaying an additional question.
Well, the court did say that under the Constitution, which is the enumeration clause, which, as you mentioned, it's not about counting citizens. It's about counting human beings, whether they're citizens or not, that adding the question wouldn't violate the actual Constitution. The problem was violating this other statute called the Administrative Procedure Act. And it's a really important statute because essentially when agencies make laws, which we call regulations, they're not accountable to the voters. You cannot vote the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, out of office. So Congress set up this system, the Administrative Procedure Act, to make sure when agencies make laws, they do it properly and that they get oversight. And the oversight is through the courts. The Supreme Court said, in this instance, agency, you didn't follow the rules properly. Now, most presidents, I would say, would comply or just sort of sit back and say, OK, this is what the Supreme Court has said. Let's go back to the drawing board. The process under the Administrative Procedure Act is laborious. It takes a long time. It would be very difficult to go through that process in time for the 2020 census. So this president, the maverick that he's been when it comes to the law, has said, listen, or it sounds like he might say through his attorney general, I'm going to bypass the Administrative Procedure Act altogether because it doesn't apply to the president. That statute does not govern the president himself. I'm going to go outside that process and do it by executive order. And the constitutionality of executive orders is squishy. It's not in the Constitution that the president can do it. But since George Washington, presidents have issued thousands of executive orders. Sometimes the court upholds them, sometimes the court does not. And that would just be, I think, a gray area we'd have to see as that goes through the courts, whether that would be allowed or not.
Yeah, I know, Kim, that when the president was a private citizen and when other members of Congress looked at President Obama's executive orders, there was a lot of disagreement as to whether or not the president could issue as many as he did. And certainly this president has taken advantage of the executive order, as you say, that has existed since our very first president, George Washington. Also, the president retweeted a comment from a Fox News morning show host in which the president seems to suggest that that host is a greater legal authority than the Supreme Court. Is the Supreme Court not the final word on this?
Well, under a famous case called Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court said that the court is the entity that construes the law, tells us what the law is when there's ambiguity. But I think what people forget is we are a country of laws. That is, citizens tend to pay attention to stop signs and stoplights and police officers. When they tell you to pull over, you pull over. That's not the case across the planet. There are other places where people ignore laws, and that's an important line to keep in mind. If this were to happen, the president were to basically say, I want to figure out how to get around the Supreme Court decision, how to get around the Census Act, and were to issue an executive order, and that order would go unchecked. What we'd have to keep in mind is then the office of the presidency, the power of the office would be enhanced for the next president and the next president. Whether you like this president or not, enhancing the office of the presidency, that amount of power, is something we all as Americans, regardless of political party, have to just be very careful of, because the next president could be one we're not comfortable with. And that amount of power, that is to sort of sidestep Supreme Court decisions, potentially sidestep acts of Congress, and do something with a presidential pen that's not expressed in the Constitution, that gives the presidency a lot of power. And that's the issue that I would be keeping my eye on here.
Hey, Kim, before we let you go, I want to get your take on this news that the Justice Department has gotten rid of the initial set of lawyers that were working on this case, and they've got a whole new slate of lawyers. What's that about?
That's really unusual. I used to be a lawyer in the Justice Department. I worked in other parts of the federal government. And these lawyers, I read the transcript in court, they were caught flat-footed. That is, the Department of Commerce made a public statement. They were not going to add the question. I think that's how it normally would go. The Supreme Court says something, you take your licks, you go on. And then midstream, another lawyer came in and said, no, 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 we're going to shift gears. My guess is that there are, career lawyers within the Justice Department that just are not comfortable with this legal position. Their heart isn't in it, or they feel compromised in terms of their ethics. And so the idea is, listen, let's bring in a new team that will go with this Plan B. That's my guess. I have no inside information, but this kind of thing is quite unusual. Most government lawyers are there for the public good. They're not there for any particular president. They go through multiple presidents, and they really care about the law, the rule of law. And here, as I suggested, we're pushing the boundaries, and we'll just have to see if one of the other two branches of government steps up to kind of confine the president's power in this regard. But as I said, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation pursuant to executive order. Lots of stuff is done by executive order. So I don't think constitutionally there's a red line here that the president would clearly be crossing. We would just have to see if the other two branches were uncomfortable with it.
I suppose it's difficult if the lawyers initially argued that there was this hard deadline and they needed to make a decision by a certain date because the census needed to be published, because that's in the Constitution, right, that it has to happen every 10 years. And, oh, what happened to that deadline now?
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah,
Kim?
it has a date, actually. It's February 1st that has to happen under the actual statute, or maybe it's April 1st. But there is a hard deadline in the Census Act that the actual count has to happen.
Yeah. And Kim, you've got a book out, How to Read the Constitution. Clearly putting that to good use today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.